Robin Hood Radio and the Robin Hood Radio Network is proud to present Leonard Lopate at Large, lively hour-long in-depth discussions providing overviews and context to topics usually covered in partial measures. His guests include leading thinkers, scientists, artists, economists, farmers, historians, authors, and politicians. Mr. Lopate is a Peabody Award winner whose numerous honors include 3 Associated Press Awards and 3 James Beard Awards.
And welcome to Leonard Lopate at Large. The image many of us have of private investigation probably involves some guy lurking around a corner trying to snap photos of unfaithful spouses or tracking down a missing statue. But private investigators and what they unearth have come a long way since Sam Spade and the Maltese Falcon. The work of real-life Sam Spades may be more boring, but in some cases more far-reaching and important. In Paper Terrorism, a concise analysis in the October issue of Harper's Magazine, private investigators Ann Diebel and Tyler Maroney detail a subtle weapon in the arsenal of anti-government vigilantes. And I'm very pleased to welcome Ann Diebel and Tyler Maroney to our show now to discuss this mysterious, brave new world. Hi.
Thank you for having us.
The term is totally new to me. What is paper terrorism?
So paper terrorism is the malicious use of official documents as well as legal filings. So liens and deeds and tax forms and bankruptcy petitions and lawsuits, all sorts of documents to retaliate against, harass, and intimidate largely public officials, government employees mostly, but also occasionally private individuals and businesses.
So, forgive me for asking this stupid question, but what's a lien, and how do I impose one on you if I decide that I want to make your life miserable?
Well, that's a great question. A lien essentially, as we mentioned in the
It's
Harper's...
spelled L-I-E-N, not
Correct.
L-E-A-N.
Correct. Is a legal claim to property in order to guarantee the payment of a debt. And this sounds like a very official document, and in fact it is, and that's actually one of the issues that we go into in the article.
So in other words, if I stop paying my rent, my landlord could put a lien on my property.
Correct. It's essentially a public filing that one individual or one company owes somebody else some money. And it's public for the very purpose of establishing that debt is owed so that others, for example, other creditors, will know about that debt.
How much trouble is it to obtain a fraudulent lien? Do you go through the same process as a legitimate one?
It's not very difficult. There are a couple ways to do it. You can go into a clerk's office or recorder's office or the Secretary of State's office, depending on where you're trying to file it, and submit it in person. You can also, with a lot of liens, you can just submit them online. And there's not much information required. The name of the creditor or secured party, and the name of the debtor, and the collateral, and a few other details.
And that's true all across the United States? Because one of the cases that you write about took place in Cook County. It was a major newspaper story. But is it any different if I do it in Brooklyn or in, I don't know, in Los Angeles?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there are so many different levels of bureaucracy around the country, right? From the smallest recorder's office all the way up to federal agencies. And liens take different shapes and forms. For context, the IRS, for example, puts liens on people who have failed to pay taxes. And so that's a lien that comes from the government towards a citizen.
How much trouble does it cause its target? And how does the target of a fraudulent lien resolve the problem?
Well, one of the issues is that the supposed debtors, so the targets of these liens, are not always notified of the existence of the lien. So a lot of the filing offices don't automatically notify them, and they might learn about the existence of a lien only if they're trying to buy a house or sell a house or take out a loan or engage in some transaction in which the existence of this fake debt will surface.
Now, you write about in your article in Harper's about a case involving a woman named Sharon Marie Phillips. She filed a lien for $100 billion. That's more than the budget of the city of New York. Wouldn't that amount alone be enough to set off alarm bells of some kind?
I think these often do set off alarm bells, but one of the problems is that the filing offices have historically been constrained in what they can do. So even if an employee at the recorder's office, sees one of these filings come in and thinks, "Wow, that can't be real," there's limited discretion, right? They can't actually do anything about the suspect filing. That's changing, but that has been the case for some time.
The two of you are private investigators. How do you get involved in these cases?
Well, let me tell you the story of how we discovered the kind of issue of paper terrorism. A few years ago, we were working on a case on behalf of a client who wanted to make an investment. And part of our assignment was to essentially vet the person to whom our client was going to give tens of millions of dollars. And as part of that essentially due diligence project, we collected information about the person's credibility and background, and as part of that process cast a wide net to find anything and everything we could about the subject of the investigation, and came across what's called a UCC filing, a Uniform Commercial Code Financing Statement, which is a kind of lien, and it is a document that is posted publicly to secure a debt. So for example, if you own a co-op and you buy the co-op with a mortgage, the bank will put a UCC on you as the borrower, essentially as a notice to the public that the bank has the right to collect that apartment if you fail to repay the loan. So there's nothing nefarious about that.
So pretty much all mortgages that go through banks have UCCs on them.
Not all, but many of them do, exactly. And the purpose of that, one of the purposes of that is that, let's say, for example, that someone who had borrowed money to buy a home, files for bankruptcy, and there are dozens of other creditors out there. A bank who had, for example, placed a UCC financing statement on that person who was now a debtor in bankruptcy, they would be able to claim any assets to the bank before other creditors. But to go back to the story of how we came across this, we found this UCC financing statement naming the person we were investigating. And by the way, this person was not an American citizen. And we found it in the Secretary of State's office's database. And by the way, that's where most UCCs live in their public documents, and anyone can search for them. And we didn't know what to make of it because the person who filed the UCC statement against the subject was a name we didn't recognize. We suspected it had been a former business partner, and it essentially said that the subject owed $100 billion.
$100 billion.
That's another astronomical and ridiculous sum of money. So we actually just saved it down to our file and called it Strange UCC. They didn't even bother reporting it to the client because we simply could not translate it.
Now, wouldn't it be in the best interest of somebody who's using this to harass somebody to come up with a more reasonable figure? Yes.
And that's been a surprising aspect of researching this is the cases that make the news, certainly, they all have these preposterous figures, in the millions or billions of dollars. Now, something to keep in mind is that the people who are filing these liens are probably not expecting to be paid.
Well, not $100 billion.
It's a symbolic gesture. So even if using a high number increases the chances of the lien getting flagged and investigated and perhaps removed from the public record, and then the filer facing penalties, I think it's worth it for them because it's a symbolic way of punishing their perceived enemies.
And even if they're not receiving any benefit from it, ultimately, there is a lot of evidence that these filings, even ridiculous ones, have a serious effect. In one case that we didn't report on in our story, but we learned a lot about, 3 years ago, a man in Tennessee who had been indicted and later convicted of driving a truck through a crowd of people in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, subsequently filed liens against the prosecutor in his case, some of the law enforcement officers, and even the judge. And it had a very effective result in that the judge ultimately had to recuse herself from the case, and a special prosecutor was brought in, so it kind of gummed up the system.
Well, the case that I cited earlier with Sharon Marie Phillips filing a lien of $100 billion, she filed it against a U.S. attorney, a judge, and some other officials. Was this a matter of retaliation?
It was. This is very much a story of revenge. So at the time she filed these liens, her brother, Devon Phillips, was being prosecuted for drug trafficking. And she was attending the trial and actually being so disruptive at the trial that the judge ordered her to leave the courtroom and she could not return. So she filed these liens essentially on behalf of her brother. Whether he was consenting to this, I don't know. But she put his name in the filings. And then she also filed some spurious legal documents with the court as well in retaliation for the prosecution of her brother and for her being thrown out of the courtroom.
Don't most of the paper terrorists call themselves sovereign citizens? And she did as well. I was surprised because she's African American, and I would associate sovereign citizens with the Posse Comitatus, which is usually seen as a white supremacist group.
The roots of the sovereign citizen movement are certainly in the Posse Comitatus, which was started in the late 60s. But the movement has broadened, especially since the 1990s, and converged in some communities with the Moorish Science Temple of America, which is a movement that has a similar set of political beliefs as the sovereign citizen movement. So really since the 90s and especially in the last decade, the ideology as a whole, this anti-government ideology, has been attracting quite a few non-white followers.
Describing their political views might require a whole show in itself, but should I go through a few of the things that they believe in? They see themselves as answerable only to their interpretation of the common law and not subject to any government statutes or proceedings. They don't recognize U.S. currency and maintain that they're free of any legal constraints. They reject most forms of taxation. And many of its 100,000 members believe the U.S. government is illegitimate. So that's 100,000 plus. I think it's estimated 100,000 more are in sympathy. That's not huge, but that's still a lot of people. And are most of them doing this kind of thing?
Well, I think first of all, I think it's fair to say that this is not an organized group. These are not card-carrying members of an organization, for example. And when we first came across this kind of paper terrorism, the sovereign citizen movement was not necessarily on our radar. It's once we started speaking to people and learning more about it that we realized that if you had to categorize a group of people who use this tactic, so to speak, that sovereign citizens are certainly that group.
The New York Times reported on a Minnesota couple who filed $250 billion in liens, and Jeff Bezos is, I think, the richest man in the world. He's worth a little over $153 billion, so nobody could ever pay that. Well, in the end, the case of Sharon Marie Phillips, who refused to have a lawyer because that would be part of working in the system, and who has changed her name to River Tally Bay, she was sentenced to 7 years in prison. So you can pay for doing this kind of thing.
Absolutely. And there are a lot of cases that start out as something seemingly minor, a traffic citation where the person who's been cited might be facing a $200 fine and will go and file a bunch of liens and get caught and then face 10 years in prison. So the actions definitely have consequences that are, in some cases disproportionate to or not anticipated by the filers.
My guests are Ann Diebel and Tyler Maroney, who have written a piece for Harper's Magazine, the October issue, called Paper Terrorism. They also have a company called QRI, Quest Research and Investigations. This is WBAI New York 99.5 FM. Do they see themselves as engaging in political protest when they issue these liens?
A lot of them do. And certainly those who identify as sovereign citizens, I think, would characterize this as a political activity. There are others who have learned these techniques who are not necessarily aligned with this sovereign ideology. And one of the groups that's been particularly susceptible to this is prisoners. So a sovereign citizen will commit an act of paper terrorism, go to prison, and then teach his or her fellow inmates, right, how to get back at a judge by filing a UCC statement.
And what does the judge have to do to get past that? Obviously, if it's bogus, then there's no real grounds for the lien. Can't you just simply say this is harassment and leave it at that?
Well, as Ann stated earlier, one of the problems we have here is that very often, quote-unquote, victims of paper terrorism aren't even really aware that they have been named as quote-unquote debtors in these until years later when they begin some kind of a transaction by running their credit history or applying for a loan.
So it's not the kind of protest that gets news coverage. It's the kind of protest that actually is secretive and just can really cause a lot of trouble in your life somewhere down the line.
Yeah, that's right. And I think it may also be a bit of a misnomer. I mean, the phrase paper terrorism is a nice soundbite, but in terrorism, I think, by its definition, must have a political aim. And in many cases, as Ann stated, this is simply an act of revenge and possibly, ideology cloaked as anger.
Have the courts decided on these? Maybe the Supreme Court will find that filing a bogus lien is protected political speech.
Well, there has been a lot of legislation passed in the past 2 decades addressing the problem, and there are various measures in place to deal with both addressing liens once they've been filed, but also trying to prevent the filing to begin with.
In 2005, there was a case involving 2 Supreme Court justices. The court had ruled that privately owned land could be taken legally through eminent domain for development by a private for-profit corporation, and Justices David Souter and Stephen Breyer found themselves facing seizures of properties that they owned. In that case, there was more press coverage.
I can imagine.
And some public sympathy. But what might happen if a sovereign citizen picks a target with more of an eye to public opinion? Well, in this case, they lost the support of the public, of course.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. We've done a lot of thinking about the kind of enforcement and what is the response to this. I mean, part of the problem is that it's happening in so many different levels of the system. And I think in some cases it's seen as simply a nuisance, and in other cases states have made it a crime to file these kinds of liens. In many cases, I think probably in most, recent laws to address this have made it more of a crime to file a lien against a public official as opposed to a private citizen.
What percentages are we talking about? Is it mostly public officials, or is it mostly could there be a lien on me without me knowing it?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's how we originally came across this, is that there is very little fact-checking or corroboration that's needed by, for example, a clerk's office if I were to walk into, a local agency and request that a lien be put on you.
It's very easy to file them, and it's difficult to get them removed. It's also costly because the victim has to bear, in many cases, has to bear the costs of the attorney fees and just the time spent dealing with this.
I mentioned earlier that in the Phillips case, Patrick Fitzgerald, a former U.S. attorney, was the target. He led the investigation into the Valerie Plame affair when he was at the Justice Department and helped to prosecute terrorism cases, including Osama bin Laden, when he was the chief of the Organized Crime Terrorism Unit. Surely somebody with his legal skill could deal with this fraudulent paperwork.
Yeah, one of the things that we did not get an opportunity to do, but we think is very valuable, is to speak to high-profile victims of this, because I agree with you that this is exactly the kind of person who would make it his business to, enforce this or to find an answer to it. I mean, he didn't lead the investigation into this. He was the U.S. attorney at the time. So our guess is that Phillips simply named him and many others. She was looking for the most powerful people that she could possibly think of who were overseeing the prosecution of her brother.
You note that the aim has been to bury enemies in paperwork and subvert the system that these people hold to be a sham. Isn't overwhelming paperwork sometimes a tactic in litigation? For example, to bury sought-after documents in mountains of other material?
Yeah, I mean, I think as Ann mentioned earlier also, frivolous lawsuits are another essentially quote-unquote weapon.
This is the sort of thing a landlord in New York State New York City could use against tenants who do pay the rent.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of evidence that landlords will file judgments, which of course are different than liens, against a tenant who is one day late paying the rent, and that judgment would appear on somebody's record and force the tenant to have to fight it and in some cases litigate it.
Haven't some corporations used tactics like these to silence critics? Doesn't Donald Trump have a record of threatening legal actions? You're nodding your head. This is radio.
This is certainly not limited to the paper terrorists, right? This approach, and something to note about the way that the filers of these false or frivolous documents, the way that they approach this is to bury their adversaries in voluminous filings, right? So in a typical civil matter, let's say, for a breach of contract, there might be 50 or 60 entries on a docket, and each of the filings might be a few pages. Whereas the sovereign citizens and others who engage in these practices will submit thousands of pages of documents. So there really is it's a way of intimidating the other side and making a hassle for them.
Do we know if there's been an increase in the incidence of paper terrorism with the rise in conservative populism following the election?
It's hard to find data that shows that explicitly, but anecdotally...
Because you say these things could be secret for years.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, anecdotally, we found no evidence that there's been any slowing down in this, even though there's been an attempt to address it at some levels. But one of the things we learned is that during economic downturns, this tactic appears to increase. And maybe that's a result of frustration or whatever it might be. And this has gone on. If you look back at the downturns in economic cycles in the last couple of generations, we've seen that there has been an increase in this, so it's possible that one is coming.
Didn't the FBI introduce the term paper terrorism? Do you know when they began to take an interest in this, or when so-called sovereign citizens started employing these tactics?
Well, these tactics have been around, as we said, since the Posse Comitatus, and were taken up by farmers during the farm crisis of the 1980s. And that was they were using liens in a unexpected way then, which was to file liens against their own property. And the idea was to delay or stop, which was not possible, but they were hoping to delay or stop foreclosures. And then the techniques spread to the militia movement in the 90s and beyond. Now, the FBI, I know, has been interested in sovereign citizens for a long time and actually declared the sovereign citizen movement one of the top domestic terror threats in, I believe it was 2010.
The Southern Poverty Law Center also has declared them terrorists. But is terrorism, you suggested earlier, maybe too strong a word to use here? It's never led to physical violence.
Well, within the sovereign citizen movement, there have been acts of physical violence. In fact, in 2010, a father and son who identified as sovereign citizens killed 2 police officers during a traffic stop. And there have been other cases like that. It's often in encounters with law enforcement that people who identify as sovereign citizens turn violent.
The reason I ask is because sometimes the word terrorist is thrown around rather lightly. Federal officials have called some environmentalists and animal rights activists terrorism. And here we're talking pretty much about paper cases, although you point out some of them might escalate into something more. Is the FBI the principal law enforcement agency investigating instances of paper terrorism?
No, it's a variety of agencies. I think the FBI. I actually haven't heard of many cases where the FBI has investigated these acts of paper terrorism. I think it tends to happen at the local or state level. And I know, for example, in Florida in 2015 and 16, the Attorney General's office defended judges and prosecutors and clerks and other officials who had fraudulent liens filed against them. So it's happening, I think, largely on the state level.
Well, even if the FBI was getting involved investigating, as we've learned recently, they could just devote a couple of hours to investigating a major issue. So they'd probably consider this rather piddly. If these people were to file liens for smaller amounts or against individuals with little political clout, might they be able to get away with it?
I think it depends on the case. I mean, you make an excellent point that imagine you were to file a fake lien for, say, $150,000 as opposed to $150 billion. Either way, the victim, so to speak, would eventually find out and fight it. And I think we don't really know why these numbers are at such outrageous
but
amounts.
But $150,000 is within the realm of possibility. If we're talking about things that involve mortgages, often there's a lot more money covered in a mortgage.
Right, but I suppose the value sometimes doesn't matter. In the case that I gave of the man in Tennessee who filed a lien against the judge, if it was $20, what he did there was essentially made him a legal adversary of the judge who was overseeing the case and therefore conflicted the judge out, so to speak. So in that sense, it was just the fact of the filing itself that had an effect.
A Minnesota law makes it a felony to file fraudulent documents to retaliate against public officials, but not private individuals.
Yes, and private individuals, depending on their financial position, right, could have a very difficult time dealing with the hassle of getting a lien removed.
What about corporations, which are people, according to some Supreme Court decision?
Yeah, and this is an aspect of this problem that has been under-examined. That these liens are and other fraudulent documents are used to harm private individuals and private businesses. So, for example, a disgruntled former employee might file a lien against his former employer, and as we've talked about, the legislation is designed primarily to protect the public officials. So even if you don't think of a corporation as a person who may be harmed, right? I mean, in these situations, there aren't many protections in place.
When an investigative firm like yours, QRI, is hired to investigate here, do you have to plow through tons of paperwork?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big part of the job. And the more obscure the paper that we can find sometimes, the better, because documents are so accessible these days to so many people on the internet. I mean, think about a uniform commercial code financing statement. I mean, that's not a very common document, but it's one that we, for example, use all the time if we're trying to assess somebody's assets, for example, or liabilities, because it might show that they have a legitimate debt that's owed to them or that they owe.
I'd imagine that you're usually called in by people who have some means, because if somebody did this to me, I'm not sure I could afford private investigators, even if you were willing to work for very little.
Yeah, in many cases we are, but our clients involve individuals and nonprofits and companies themselves. And I think that's a great point, but if we could expand the definition of paper terrorism a little bit, I mean, this focus was on liens themselves in most cases, but if you look at the concept of, say, social media shaming, where people will simply post information, inaccurate information on the internet that is very hard to scrub, very hard to expunge, that in many cases has similar effects.
My guests are Tyler Maroney and Ann Diebel, who are the authors of an article in the October Harper's magazine called Paper Terrorism. They are also the private investigators at QRI, Quest Research and Investigations. We're talking about paper terrorism. Tyler, aren't you a former journalist? Does the work you're now doing in any way resemble investigative journalism?
Very much so, yeah. And I think that it's sometimes assumed that the work that we do, that we have the ability to do things that other people don't. In some cases we do because we have licenses that give us access to databases, but it's a very similar job.
But in a New York Times opinion piece, The Boring Life of a Private Investigator, you wrote that you're routinely asked to break the law.
Yeah,
Sam Spade used to break the law all the time.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, maybe there is a benefit to that mythology around us, but the fact of the matter is that we are as honest and hardworking and ethical as anybody, and we sometimes fight against that stereotype. And I mean, we've had clients who have asked us to do things they're clearly criminal, maybe under the assumption that we can do that.
Such as what? You mean breaking into somebody's
hacking
home?
into email, impersonating somebody. And if you Google the phrase private investigator, you get media stories, as we all know from recent years, in which people who are private investigators have been accused of doing exactly this.
Has your work ever come close to what Humphrey Bogart did to Sam Spade and Philip Marlowe?
Well, you used the word boring at the beginning of this conversation. I'll try to parry that a little bit. I mean, I think it's...
Are you checking out cheating spouses, or is that no longer something that people care about? Or
investigators do plenty of that. We don't do matrimonial work, but certainly our job to try to find evidence of corruption, for example, or of large-scale fraud is a fascinating job.
And didn't you get a PhD in literature?
Yes, I did.
How does that lead you to become a private investigator? Did you like film noir?
I did like film noir, but I was a researcher. I was reading and writing as a PhD student and as a postdoc, and I decided that I simply didn't want to research Henry James and Theodore Dreiser for the rest of my life.
It's been done by a lot of other people before you.
I know that.
It's hard to come up with something new, isn't it? Tyler wrote about investigators pushing legal boundaries, but don't most of us leave lots of material in plain sight?
We do, wittingly and unwittingly. And so that's something that, of course, we all know about from social media. People are sharing information about themselves. But I wonder how much people could discover about themselves if they just did a really thorough Google search of their own name.
You wrote an opinion piece called Your Mother's Maiden Name is Not a Secret. Are we making things too easy for investigators, legal or otherwise?
I think a lot of people are making things easy for investigators, and we appreciate that, even if we might have some concerns about privacy as well. So people will, for example, make quite clear on their social media accounts who their relatives are or where they work. And so if we are trying to gather information about someone, it's being handed to us.
Although there are sometimes misleading information. If you were to Google me and read some articles in the New York Times, you would find misinformation that I can't really control.
Yeah, I mean, a part of our job is not just to find information, but to try to make sense of it and to look for patterns, and then back that up with conversations with people who are in the know. And I think that although we sometimes call ourselves fact gatherers, that reduces what we do a little bit, and because the analysis is really key to the job.
Do you also advise people on how to avoid mistakenly leaking information?
Well, in some cases, I mean, take Ann's op-ed as an example of that. That comes out of her experience and ability to analyze information that we come across in our day-to-day. And similar, the Harper's piece we wrote is an attempt to kind of analyze and to push into the public some of the obscure records that we come across. I suppose with the intent of alerting the public to the fact that this exists.
How are digital technologies applied in your work? Isn't digging up information being done by computer algorithms these days?
Yeah, I mean, certainly old school gumshoeing techniques, knocking on people's doors and interviewing witnesses, so to speak, is a crucial part of the job. But being able to collect and gather and crunch and analyze large data sets is incredibly useful and powerful. I mean, largely because that information lives out there, put out whether by government websites themselves or by companies. And knowing how to collect and analyze that is a crucial part of it.
There's something we've learned, or well, we already knew this, but this was underscored by the research that we did for the Harper's article, is that you can't always trust the information that you find on the internet or through official sources. And so we try to complement whatever digital resources we have with actual conversations with people who have knowledge of what we're investigating. And sometimes if you see, for example, a public record that just doesn't look right for some reason, if it's $1 billion lien or there's just something that's suspect about it, the information isn't consistent with other things you've seen, then you try to chase down the truth and talk to people who might have the answer.
Is the work you do anything like opposition research in politics?
It's similar in the sense that we are collecting information on people and trying to understand it. Absolutely.
And in fact, your QRI website describes your company's work, and quoting, "We collect evidence for litigators, handle internal investigations, unravel complex corporate structures, spearhead cases that support the public interest, and conduct due diligence." Given all that information and paperwork, digital and physical, is this a growth industry?
I would say that it is. I mean, the industry has expanded to exactly to your point, where it requires that we have people who understand digital data. And yet, I think it would be a mistake to say that being a company that does not know how to speak to people is a mistake. I mean, to Ann's point, I think we trust information that lives, quote, in the public record way too much. And we can define the public record in different ways. I mean, let's take 3 categories. One being information that anyone can put out there, say in a tweet or on a Facebook post. 2, information that lives in a database that is behind a paywall, like LexisNexis, for example. And 3, maybe information that is provided and maintained by government websites. And those are 3 very different categories of information that we all in many ways rely upon.
We've been talking about using this as a weapon against government officials. Are there cases where the tables are turned, where government officials are in effect intimidating people with threats of legal action or paper terrorism? I'm thinking about a case that Rolling Stone wrote an article about last March. I don't know if you're familiar with the case of the rapper Meek Mill, who's had repeated run-ins with a judge named Janice Brinkley.
We are familiar with it. We worked on it.
Yeah, this is a case in which we were hired by a nonprofit that works for criminal justice reform and also working with Meek Mill's criminal defense lawyers. And the investigation was multi-pronged, but among the things that we did, in addition to investigating police misconduct, was to examine the judge who had put Meek in prison for violating probation. And part of that is a simple attempt to find out information that's publicly available, because the rumor or the allegation and the suspicion had been that the judge had something very personal in this case and was not being neutral and unbiased. And among the things we did was simply looked for any litigation naming the judge, not in her capacity as a judge, but as a party.
And you discovered from Pennsylvania state databases that Judge Brinkley's name was on dozens of civil lawsuits?
Yeah, she
What kinds of cases?
To be very litigious. She's a property owner. She has sued and been involved in legal disputes with tenants of buildings that she owns. She has been involved in lawsuits against hotels where she has stayed, against contractors she's hired to work on buildings that she owns. And the purpose of this was to try to learn as much as we could about this. And by the way, nearly every piece of paper that we found on her had been put in the public record by her herself, because many of these are cases that she filed and therefore making them public.
Do public officials have the authority to block the release of information that might help defendants or tenants or voters? For example, New York State has a Freedom of Information Act. Do you know how well the state or local governments do at complying with those rules?
Yeah, I mean, filing FOIL and FOIA at the federal level request is a big part of our job. And very often we get, and again, that's a request for public records, to use that phrase again. We get denied on various grounds of whether it be national security or privacy concerns, and in some cases, like media organizations, we will fight those denials.
And New York City's government, especially the NYPD, has resisted releasing statistics on police conduct. So,
Or police
doesn't that go
misconduct.
against the law?
It's a good question. I mean, I think we don't personally litigate these cases in most cases, but we fight for access to information that we believe is public.
And last March, BuzzFeed reported on leaked NYPD files that showed that hundreds of officers were kept in their jobs despite serious offenses.
Mm-hmm. I mean, among the issues that came out in Meek Mill's case was that there was, in Philadelphia, what was called a do not call list. This is reported on in the Philadelphia Inquirer, in which there were police officers, detectives, who were kept on the force, but who prosecutors specifically knew not to call to testify in cases because they knew that they had some kind of a record of either misconduct or other inappropriate behavior.
What had Meek Mill done to upset the judge?
Well, Meek is someone who had been arrested and convicted of a crime more than 10 years ago now, when he was very young, in his early 20s, and has spent virtually his entire adult life on probation or parole. And he was arrested and imprisoned by Judge Brinkley late last year after relatively minor violations of probation, such as popping a wheelie on a bike during a video shoot. This was in New York, or getting into a physical altercation.
And I just saw a guy do that today, this
Right.
morning. That's against the law?
Well,
I just thought he was living dangerously.
Technically, it is. It's a good question. I mean, and again, this is another issue that we think a lot about, is the criminal justice system itself, and whether or not a violation of probation should result in an imprisonment.
Meek Mill managed to come all the way up, as he put it. But what about poor defendants who might be treated as he was? Do investigators like yourselves provide pro bono services ever?
Yeah, absolutely we do. I mean, I think it's no secret that Meek, and he talks about this himself, he has, wealthy friends and benefactors who helped him navigate the criminal justice system and get out of this. And without that, he may still be in prison. But I think, to his credit, he is now involved in a number of nonprofits and other work to help shed light on this issue so that others don't suffer the way he did.
Is there an international aspect to your work? Because right now, information is global.
Very much so, although I think it should be said that there is nowhere in the world that provides information as transparently and as publicly as the United States.
Which would seem to be a good thing.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, for example, if you want to find out if somebody has a criminal record in the United Kingdom, you can only do that with their consent. But in this country, you can do it very easily as a third party. You don't have to be a private investigator or a journalist.
So that means if somebody gets involved in, even a foreign business person gets involved in American business, then suddenly we can know a lot more about them than we would if they just stayed in Britain or France?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, that goes right to the core of this article that we wrote about the availability, and it's a conversation to be had about public records. I mean, we can find out very easily, and by we, I mean anyone who is savvy with a computer, if somebody owns a home, how much the mortgage was for, how much they bought it for, who their relatives are. The list goes on and on and on and on. And that's just simply not possible largely because of either bureaucratic restrictions or privacy laws in foreign countries.
We're talking about the work of private investigators with two private investigators, Tyler Maroney and Ann Diebel, who have written an article called Paper Terrorism for the October issue of Harper's Magazine. Your company's website says that part of what you do is to spot patterns hidden in disparate groups of big data. How do you do that? Well,
one example would be to very often we're given big data sets, or we go and collect big data sets. And again, I'll use the government database as an example. Like, governments provide access to data. So, for example, if I wanted to scrape and collect every piece of data that the Securities and Exchange Commission, which regulates the securities markets, has, we can do that, and we can collect that data and then write code to look for evidence of, say, every single case in which somebody with the last name Lopate has sat on the board of a public company. And that.
So you're using algorithms.
So using algorithms to, once we've collected the data, to go through it and find the patterns.
You have to wonder what life was like before we had algorithms to do that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, there's a great scene in Chinatown when Jack Nicholson goes into I guess it's the kind of recorder of deeds office, and he's looking for property records, and he's opening these big dusty books, and he needs one of the records, and he kind of flips through it and finds it, and he coughs into his shoulder and rips the page out and stuffs it in his jacket, and that's, we wouldn't need to do that anymore. We could just simply query a database.
You also say that you make connections where none seem apparent. What kinds of connections?
Well, we might look, for example, at corporate records and the officers and directors of a company and the registered agents that they use. And let's say there's the officers and directors of two companies are completely distinct, the sets of officers and directors, but the registered agent is the same, or other examples where you can find commonality between two entities or two people who seem to be unconnected.
So then that would set off an alarm?
Potentially.
And what would be the ultimate goal, the ultimate result of discovering something like that?
Well, there might be a conflict of interest. There might be an undisclosed relationship that would have some effect on the business that these people are conducting.
And you also, go ahead.
I'll just give one example. We were once hired by a company to investigate an anonymous whistleblower allegation that there was vendor fraud going on, which essentially means that they suspected that somebody at the company was routing business to themselves. And the way we proved this was that we collected, as Ann states, some corporate records, some business documents that showed the names of one of the executives at the company's wife had set up, and we were able to connect the name of that company to a vendor of the company itself. So we were able to prove that although the executive himself did not put his name on the corporate record, his wife's name was on it and his home address was on it.
And would that lead to a court case? Or could he be arrested for that?
It depends on the context.
He could be sued by the company he was working for.
That's right. That's what we would call an internal investigation. So the company itself hired us to investigate that. And what happens often in those cases is that if we find evidence of criminal activity, the case can, in some situations, if serious enough, be referred to law enforcement.
The Meek Mill case actually wound up going on NBC's nightly news, Dateline NBC, right? With a member of your firm going with Lester, taking Lester Holt into the story?
Our partner, Luke Brindle Kim, who spearheaded and led this case for nearly a year, part of the assignment was for us, and this is very rare, to be very public about the work that we'd done, because in addition to doing work on behalf of his lawyers, there was a real sense of urgency here that there was a wrong that had been committed, and one of the ways to help reform that is to get the word out, and that involved speaking with reporters who called us.
And as I said at the beginning, your article is the first time I ever heard of paper terrorism. So this is something that obviously has been happening for quite a while, but the general public is unaware of unless you wind up becoming a victim or you're one of the people who actually imposes these kinds of liens on somebody as a matter of retaliation?
Yes, I think that it's largely an issue that people don't learn about until they're affected by it. Mm-hmm. And we happen to learn about it in this somewhat circuitous way by seeing a document that was suspect and then trying to figure out how this could have been filed. But generally, it's also something that's, even if people are aware of it, is sometimes dismissed as this laughable thing that these kooky people do. But it has real effects, and people spend a lot of time and money, the people who are victimized by this, a lot of time and money getting these completely fabricated records out of their lives.
I've been thinking about filing a 100 million ruble lien against Vladimir Putin. Would I have much success?
You might need to go to Russia to walk into the filing office. I don't know if you can do it online.
Well, all jokes aside, you could do that today, I suppose, depending on the office. And
well, there are representatives. There are oligarchs who live here, who have connections to him.
Right.
Is this any different than what the government does when they sanction somebody?
You mean filing a fake lien?
Yeah. Well, if we sanction certain people for political activity, for example, right now that there have been any number of sanctions imposed as part of the Russia investigation, that's different than this.
Yeah, I think so. Go ahead, Ann.
Well, and I would hesitate to characterize, although there's a political ideology behind these acts, I would hesitate to characterize the filing of fraudulent documents as political activism, because it's almost always personal vendetta. Even and sometimes it's cloaked as I am taking a stand, I am exercising my sovereignty and expressing my political views and so forth. But I think it's largely a personal matter.
Where do we go from here? Is this just going to keep on continuing? Do you worry that by publishing this article, you've given some people an idea?
Well, we hope so, or many ideas. I mean,
yeah. Well, I'm worried that there are some listeners out there right now who are thinking, "Oh, gee, that sounds like a good idea."
Well, I'm such an optimist. I thought you meant for reform.
We'll look up our names in the databases every month for the next year and make sure nothing's being filed against us.
Right.
And that's how I would find out. Just checking your names.
Well, I suppose either searching for your own name, which I suppose everyone should do, or the credit reporting agencies recommend that we run our credit reports annually. I think that's probably a good idea because this would show up on a credit report.
You can Google some people's names and nothing comes up, and you can Google other people's names and hundreds of thousands of Googles come up. So
you have to know where to look. Yeah. So I mean, if you want to find, for example, whether someone has a lien placed on his or her property, then you have to look at the property records in that county.
Ann Diebel and Tyler Maroney's article, Paper Terrorism, appeared in the October issue of Harper's Magazine. And in case you need any help from a private investigator, you can get in touch with them at QRI. That's Quest Research and Investigations. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that brings us to the end of today's show. My great thanks to Ann Diebel and Tyler Maroney, to Hugh Sansom, who produced this segment, to Charlie Morrow, who composed our theme music, to Reggie Johnson, who was at the audio controls, and to my assistant producer, Jesse Lent, who makes things run smoothly. Lopate at Large comes to you on Saturdays at 4 and Tuesdays at noon. You can subscribe to Leonard Lopate at Large podcast on iTunes and by clicking on Robin Hood Radio's archive program site, which is robinhoodradio.com. You can also check out Leonard Lopate at Large Facebook page. We hope to see you next week.